Emerging markets are on high alert as currencies around the world fluctuate, igniting fears of another financial crisis ahead. What factors should we be paying attention to? And people just can't get enough Crazy Rich Asians. The blockbuster hit is still luring audiences and breaking box office records. What makes this story so enduring, and what does the all-Asian cast mean to fans? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. On the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which symbolized the start of the 2008 financial crisis, fear is stalking emerging markets around the world. Over the last 6 months, some of the world's fastest growing economies have stumbled, stalled or plunged. Pressure from global factors such as tariffs, sanctions and political tensions has exposed frailties in these markets, including the reliance on funding from foreign investors. As the U.S. economy booms, investors have been lured back, leaving these markets behind and vulnerable. The collapse of the Turkish lira, Argentina's 50 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, and grim economic predictions for other markets, including Brazil, India and Indonesia, are all raising eyebrows. Are these symptoms of an underlying trend and a greater looming crisis? Are we witnessing an emerging markets meltdown or just a temporary slip? Joining me for the discussion are, in the Beijing studio, Daniel Gallardo, founder of Global Commercial Business and an MBA candidate at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University, and from Taipei, Ross Feingold, senior advisor at the DC International Advisory. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Feingold, we're seeing an outbreak of economic tumbles ranging from slums to panics to actual bailouts across diverse markets. What was the event that triggered this chain reaction, or is this trend a compilation of many different events?
Well, many people identify the trade disputes and increasing tariffs around the world, but that's really looking for the easy solution. I think when we look at the countries that have had currency fluctuations or are encountering other problems, we see a pattern, whether it's in this current cycle or previous cycle. And some of those similarities are weak institutions, over-borrowing by governments or corporates or consumers, and currencies that are weak and countries that are not able to manage these pressure points adequately. Regulatory failures, for example, weak political institutions, frequent changes in government. And that's a pattern that leads to these kinds of fluctuations, rather than blaming it on the trade disputes.
Well, Argentina and Turkey are seen as headline cases. Mr. Gallardo, what went wrong and how are their cases different? For instance, tell us about the Argentina's case. Is it exceptional or is it part of a trend? Will the 50 billion IMF bailout ultimately solve the problem?
Argentina, in the case of Argentina, has their own consequence due to this situation, this scenario. We are looking at a scenario in which the capitals are transferring to a less risky markets. So in the case of Argentina, Argentina has three main reasons in which this situation is complicated. The first one is the debt versus GDP ratio is very high. The second one is the country risk. The last few months increased considerably. And the third one is that the external financing are getting restricted. So all these factors are making the current government of Argentina to rethink new policies, new economic policies, in order to fight against the two biggest problems that Argentinian economy has. The first one is the fiscal deficit and the commercial deficit.
Okay. Mr. Feingold, what is the story about Turkey?
Well, Turkey is involved in a number of political disputes, both internally as well as with its neighbors. That's certainly going to give foreign investors a reason to be very cautious about investing in Turkey. And again, it's also the issue of the institutions and very rapid change to the structure of political institutions in Turkey. And that's something that foreign investors are uncomfortable with. And the combination of Turkey's disputes with its neighbors, whether it's involvement in Syria, Iran, disputes with Israel, disputes with Greece, a number of issues on its periphery. There's also been worsening relations with the United States, which is historically a strong ally of Turkey. So when relations are bad between Turkey and the United States, that's also another reason that foreign investors are going to become more cautious about investing in Turkey. These are actually problems that are within the ability of the Turkish government to stop, but it requires a political will to make the tough decisions to address concerns about its fiscal stability and, again, its political stability.
Well, Argentina and Turkey have been the big stories, but other emerging markets are also not doing very well. Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia. So, Mr. Feingold, do you see a butterfly effect or some kind of a contagion taking place?
Well, that's certainly a pattern if you look at past cycles, whether it was the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, the crash of the dot-com bubble, the SARS and Iraq war, which occurred simultaneously in 2003, and then the financial crisis of 2008, that yes, there tends to be some contagion as investors will retreat to safer locations, and that might actually benefit the United States, oddly enough. So although President Trump is often criticized for some of his trade policies, when he talks about investors coming back to the United States, whether it's American companies or foreign companies showing a new willingness to invest in the United States, there is some truth to that, and we see that with some of the investment decisions by global investors.
What role exactly, Mr. Gallardo, does rising U.S. interest rates play in the performance of or the lack of performance in the emerging markets?
Like in the market in which there is a very dependent about the capital, the foreign capital, this situation would complicate the emerging markets because they are looking for less risky markets, and this interest rate are more attractive for those investments than like the emerging markets.
Is there some kind of a link between the U.S.'s economic boom with the situation in emerging markets, if there is any? Mr. Gallardo, still to you?
Yes. This booming of the United States economy, it also has a consequence of our in an emerging market, because if I would invest in something in long term, I would prefer to do it in the United States than instead of this emerging market like Argentina. They are more stable market of this United States, so I would definitely go and invest there.
So are we talking about some kind of a vicious cycle when things go bad? The more Argentina needs foreign currency, the more these people will leave because the market is not doing very well, and that would in turn make the market perform even worse.
Yes, because of that, I think that Argentina has to correct their internal indicators. For example, like I was saying before, like the deficit, the fiscal deficit and the commercial deficit are two main points that Argentina government has to attack to reduce the dependency of this external capital.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Feingold, what about China's case? China is also a very important emerging economy. We know that on Friday the Chinese renminbi strengthened to 6.8362 against the US dollar, and it's also said that President Trump is ready to go on tariffs, targeting another 267 billion US dollars of Chinese goods on top of the 200 billion he previously threatened. Where does China fall in his spectrum of economic uncertainty?
Well, the important role that China could play here, which it's been doing with some success over the past 2 years, is to say that China is a supporter of a rules-based international trading system, that China continues to support multilateral trade agreements, and that's something that China has been championing both in Asia and globally, but also for China to make the case to foreign and global investors that China has a very positive growth outlook over the long term, which we all know is to be true, and that China is strengthening its institutions, which China is making some effort at doing, and also that China is deregulating and creating a welcome space for foreign investors, which of course is one of the concerns of the United States in ongoing trade talks. But even in that regard, we see some positive movement within the past few days that it looks like the United States and China are going to resume trade talks at a very high level. And of course, as business people, we hope that the two sides will reach a deal that works for both, not just the two leaders, but also for the investors and companies from both sides.
Of course, in other countries as well. Finally, still to Mr. Feingold, maybe we know exactly a decade ago Lehman Brothers collapsed, and this week billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio warned that the U.S. was about 2 years away from a downturn thanks to the fading effects of President Trump's tax cuts, as you mentioned too. And J.P. Morgan also released a new model this week saying that the next financial crisis could come in 2020. What do you think of that? Should we start preparing from now on?
Well, it might be a little too early to panic, but we have to keep in mind that even preceding the election of President Trump, towards the end of the Obama presidency, economic data was starting on a positive trajectory, and that has not only continued, but the velocity of that positive news has increased under President Trump. So, of course, President Trump takes some credit for that. But inevitably, this positive cycle will have to have a downturn, whether it's in 2020 or sometime further into the future. Of course, we can't predict with accuracy, but we shouldn't be surprised that there are going to be people in the market who are going to say that this cycle has started to run its course and that people are going to start to turn bearish.
Okay, it's time to go. Many thanks to my two guests, Daniel Gallardo, founder of Global Commercial Business and MBA candidate at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University, and in Taipei, Ross Feingold, senior advisor at the DC International Advisory. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll be taking a very short break, and when I come back, Crazy Rich Asians have taken the world by storm. The blockbuster film keeps breaking new box office records and smashing Asian stereotypes. I'll be asking the screenwriter why the story is so irresistible. The romantic comedy Crazy Rich Asians is going crazy rich at the U.S. box office. The film, which was released in the U.S. on August the 15th, became a blockbuster on day one. It grossed over $135 million domestically and $165 million worldwide in just under a month, becoming the highest-grossing Hollywood studio romantic comedy since 2009. The classic Cinderella story of an everyday girl meeting her Prince Charming, and surprise, he's rich, is a tried and true plot line. So what makes this movie stand out? Its all-Asian cast gives the Hollywood screen a much-needed refreshment, but what else is important about this film, and what does it mean to be Asian, especially in a Western-dominated industry like Hollywood? For more, I talked to Adele Lim, a TV and film writer based in Los Angeles, who co-wrote the screenplay adaptation for the movie. I started by asking her about her reaction to the film's instant and to some extent unexpected success.
I think we were all hoping for the best, but trying to keep our expectations very realistic. And there was a big push by the Asian Americans here to, drum up support for the movie, to make sure that the awareness was out there. And a lot of Asian Americans even bought out like whole theaters in support. We had a wonderful outshowing of support from even people who couldn't afford to buy whole theaters. They would, on Twitter, offer to buy a few tickets, maybe a dozen tickets for people who couldn't afford to go. And we thought this was, a wonderful, wonderful show of support. But really, it was audiences across the board. The mainstream audience really turned out for it. And the numbers just stayed consistent through the second weekend and the third weekend through word of mouth.
So what do you think makes the success of this film so enduring in the end?
I haven't really spoken to a lot of the experts on it, and I'm going entirely on anecdotal evidence of people who've reached out to me. But it seems like the reason the numbers didn't really drop off is that people were, two things. They were going back to watch the movie, to rewatch it, and a lot of people who watched it, especially the Asian Americans, came back and brought their parents to watch it. I was especially touched by the stories of people who hadn't gone to the movies for years. And, you know, as I said, mainstream America, across the board, people of all demographics and races turned out to watch it. There was something about it that appealed to them.
Okay.
But specifically for the Asian American audience, there was a generation which, you know, which didn't really go to the movies that much because they didn't feel there was anything in there for them. And their children felt that there was. And there's one email that I got that I found particularly touching. A woman brought her mother in, and you know, her mother who doesn't really like the movies, and just from the opening music in the movie, she said that she remembered the song, and it was from her childhood, and suddenly felt like there was much more in the movie that spoke to her.
Okay, so what about the novel? As we know, this movie was adapted from a novel of the same name, and you were offered to write the screenplay adaptation for the film, and this, I understand, was your first feature project as a screenplay writer. Why did you accept the invitation from director John Chu to work on it in the first place?
Well, oh, yes. Well, John Chu and I had worked together previously. We'd sold a television show to Fox, and we sold a pilot, but the show didn't get picked up, but we had a very good time working with each other. And so when he was approached with the project, there was an existing script by a different writer, Pete Chiarelli, a wonderful writer. But John Chu, after reading the book and reading the script, felt that he had a lead character that was an Asian female and really wanted an Asian female voice and point of view. So he and I had worked together. He reached out to me. I was working full-time on a different television show, and but I love John, and so I read the script and read the book. And from the first few pages, I was immediately committed to it. I wrote him back right away, called him, and said, I am in 100%. What John hadn't realized about me, he didn't know it at the time, but I grew up in Malaysia, and the Chinese of Malaysia and Singapore are culturally similar, if not identical. And so all the languages in the book, the Malay, the Hokkien dialects, all of it, these are things I grew up with.
Yeah.
The family dynamics, the food, all parts of it were things that I grew up with and knew intimately, and was so excited for the opportunity to get to write for.
I guess that's why the story is so irresistible to you. But many movie reviews speak highly of your work, saying you have brought specificity and emotional beats into the script, especially in ways female characters interact with each other across cultural boundaries. Do you agree? If so, how do you think you manage that?
Well, I'm very flattered, but I think a lot of the credit for cultural specificity goes to Kevin Kwan, who wrote the book. He grew up in Singapore, and it came from a place of love. And when I read an article about him and his process for writing the book, he had posted on his computer that he'd written the word joy, so that it came from a place of joy. And I remember thinking that that was a wonderful thing to hold on to when I was writing the script. And for me, it was a big celebration. I'd been writing for American television shows for 16 years. And the majority of the shows that I wrote for had a lead character of, a white male. And, they were always fun shows, but I could never truly write from my own experience. And this project was the first time that I got to really, truly write about the family dynamics I know and the families that I knew. And in, my family particularly, we have a lot of very strong female dynamics in there, from
like
my grandmother, my mother, and
families.
my aunts, and how the yes, exactly, and how involved they are in our lives. And things that may be perceived as being overly controlling by, a Western society, in Asian societies, we're more forgiving of that because we know that it comes from a place of love.
Yeah.
And we thought that it was very important, John Chu and I and Michelle Yeoh, who plays the character of Eleanor, wanted to make sure that we brought that level of understanding to the character.
Now, the movie has been talked about a lot for having the first all-Asian cast, right, in the Hollywood movie since the Joy Luck Club, dating back in 1993. The female main characters, as you have mentioned, Rachel, is perceived by her boyfriend's family, who lives in Singapore, not as Asian American, but wholly American. She is considered foreign and not one of us by her Asian boyfriend's family. So how accurately does this fictional concept illustrate the kind of divide? We're going into the abstract here, the divide between Asians and Asian Americans that both communities seem to be trying to navigate today.
Yes. Yes, well, I wouldn't, call it a hard divide. I don't think we're, at odds or there's any antagonism, but they are very different. And I think it's interesting for me because I grew up as an Asian in Asia, and then I came to America at a later stage. So I've been able to sort of see both sides of it. And in terms of, how true it is in terms of Eleanor's and that family's feeling towards Rachel, I think it's important to state that the movie doesn't speak for all Asians, but I at least, leaned into my own family's experience. And there is the feeling, with the families that I grew up with, that, having your children marry someone from a different culture was alarming. But again, it came from a place of, them not wanting to lose you and them not wanting to lose a connection with their children and losing their children to a different culture. And I think this is applicable to a lot of, not just Asian Americans Asians throughout the world, but communities, that send their children overseas for studies, for university. There's the feeling of always wanting the best for your children, but with that comes a risk that you'd lose them. So I think in terms of the cultural divide, there is a little bit of that. It comes from, everything that the character of Eleanor says in terms of Rachel being different and not understanding them and not appreciating their values, there is a deeper feeling to it from Eleanor of not wanting to lose her son.
Basically, that's how culture passes on from generation to generation, right? So that kind of force needs to be there, although we do need to go out and embrace the world. But looking at the movie, looking at the experience, looking back at this experience, what do you think could be a message, a central message that your team, that your effort want to deliver through this movie?
Well, I think one of the most compelling aspects of this movie was the character of Rachel Chu, who is an Asian American, but, doesn't feel entirely at home in Asia. And that's an experience that a lot of Asian Americans have talked about identifying with. And so I think at the end of the day, the message that would be applicable, to Asian Americans or to anyone really, is to feel comfortable in your own skin, to embrace where you are, but also to stay true and embrace the cultures that you were born into and that you grew up with.
The film not only shows a clash of cultures or subcultures, but also a clash of classes, if I can use this word. Indeed, the lifestyle of the main characters you don't really see in an everyday life. And people in the movie live and breathe in an exclusive sphere of wealth and opulence. Do you think this movie misses the bigger picture and creates a wrong, crazy rich impression of Asian people, or that's beside the point of a romantic comedy, escapist film?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it is a criticism that's been leveled at the movie or an observation made of it, that it is not an accurate depiction of Singaporean society or Chinese society. But I think it's important to note that that's not what the movie sets out to do. We're not a reflection of all Asians or even all Asians in Singapore. This is a story about a fictional story about a very specific family. And I think there are a couple of other things to note about this, which is it's very easy to feel alienated from characters that are so rich that you don't feel like you can relate to them. But I think in this particular instance, that it was a great way to illustrate what the money meant to them in that opening scene of the movie and in the book. That for many communities, money and wealth is a way to achieve equality on a world level. And it may seem superficial to others, but it is an important aspect that people take seriously. And even in the cultures that I grew up in, for Western societies, they may see it as gauche, to put an emphasis on money. But for many communities across the world, money is not seen as being superficial or being shallow, but it is a way to take care of your family. It is a way to share your resources with the ones you love and take care of them. So we felt like, you know, that was another aspect we wanted to highlight in the movie without speaking overtly about it.
That's true. Actually, I think the love for money, not as a bad thing, also explains why Asians work so hard, right? This is behind a lot of the things that we're seeing.
Yes.
It's true. It's true on the mainland as well. I mean, people love money. That's why they are trying to produce, to trade, you know, to do business with everybody instead of having, you know, a kind of a mission or philosophy to spread. There's a cultural difference there. So this movie is a significant success in Hollywood, we've already mentioned, but still, do you see there's a lack of appealing to white Americans, maybe?
I don't think so at all. It's the highest grossing romantic comedy America has had in 9 years. And so, if anything, I feel that that tells us there's a thirst for that material, and that the American audience is actually much more open-minded and open-hearted than perhaps even the studios give them credit for. The big concern with the movie when we were putting it together was that, you know, we were an all-Asian cast, which was very important to the director, to Kevin Kwan, to the producers, to myself. But there was also the concern that because we didn't have a lot of Hollywood A-listers, that the movie would not do as well. And really, if anything, the movie has been incredibly successful at launching the careers, I think, or supporting and elevating the careers of many of the actors in it. And it seemed that, you know, with the right talent and the right story and, you know, authenticity in detail and passion for storytelling was enough to get people to come out and really sort of see and experience the movie and the story we wanted to tell.
Okay, thank you very much, Adele Lim, screenwriter for the film Crazy Rich Asians. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point. Have a good weekend.